The battlefield was nothing but smoke and frozen mud. For days, the front had been locked in stalemate, a narrow strip of scorched earth between two shattered forests. The Soviets attacked every morning and again before dusk, rolling forward behind waves of armor and men. The German defense was collapsing, one machine gun nest at a time, each silenced by mortar fire or tanks grinding through the snow. But in one small sector, amid the ruins of a burned-out farmhouse, a single gunner kept firing long after the others had gone silent. His weapon, an MG-42 mounted on a rusted tripod, spat death with mechanical precision, cutting down anything that moved through the mist. The Soviets began to call the position the Phantom Nest because no matter how many times they shelled it, the gun would return. The truth was stranger than they could have imagined. The gunner had rigged something no manual had ever taught, a system of mirrors scavenged from wrecked vehicles, fragments of glass, and even the reflective surface of a periscope from a destroyed tank. He'd mounted them at odd angles around his position, turning the ruined farmhouse into a crude network of reflections. Through these, he could see without exposing himself, firing at shadows he knew were real. The trick was madness, born from exhaustion and instinct, but it worked. When the Soviets flanked, he saw them. When they tried to snipe his window, they hit a decoy. When they advanced, they walked straight into lines of fire that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, his comrades thought it was luck. No one could survive that long under such fire. But after the third day, when the Soviets sent an entire platoon against his position and still failed to take it, the stories began to spread. They said he had eyes everywhere, that he could see through smoke and snow, that he wasn't fighting like a man anymore, but like a machine. In truth, he was barely human at all by then. Unshaven, deaf from the gunfire, his hands blistered and raw from feeding belts of ammunition into the weapon. He hadn't slept in 2 days. He drank melted snow and chewed frozen bread when the barrel cooled. The mirrors around him were cracked and streaked with soot, but they gave him what no soldier could afford to lose: awareness. When night fell, the field glowed faintly from burning wrecks. The gunner used the reflections to aim by firelight, catching movements that no naked eye could see. Every burst of gunfire illuminated his world like lightning. He no longer thought in words, only angles, distances, motion. To him, the mirrors weren't tools. They were survival itself. Each one was a fragment of control in a battlefield designed to erase it. By dawn, when the next Soviet push came, they advanced cautiously, crawling low, convinced the gunner must finally be dead. But the moment the first soldier broke cover, the MG-42 erupted again. Not from where they expected, but from a new angle. A reflection of a reflection. The Soviets dove for cover, shouting in confusion, firing into shadows that fired back. The illusion was complete. The gunner's crazy mirror setup had turned one position into many, one man into an army. When the battle ended hours later, the farmhouse was gone, reduced to a smoking crater. But near its edge, half buried in the mud, the gun still stood upright, its barrel warped, the mirrors shattered, but still catching light. The line had held longer than anyone believed possible, and somewhere beneath the smoke and ruin, the man who had built his own vision from broken glass had proven that in war, madness and genius were often the same thing. When the smoke cleared the next morning, the field was unrecognizable. Craters overlapped each other like wounds in the earth, and what had once been snow was now a gray paste of ash and mud. The Soviet attack had failed again, leaving the ground littered with helmets, rifles, and the outlines of men frozen in motion. From a distance, it looked like the front had gone still, but beneath the ruins of the farmhouse, the gunner was alive. He had dug himself deeper during the night, turning the debris into cover, rebuilding his strange setup of mirrors piece by piece. Each shard was positioned with purpose, some facing the tree line, others angled toward the open field. What little sunlight filtered through the smoke struck them, sending thin flashes of light into places the enemy couldn't reach. He moved with the precision of a craftsman, not a soldier. Every mirror had its angle, every reflection a reason. One let him see behind the barn ruins where flanking soldiers liked to hide. Another caught the faint shimmer of movement near the riverbank. A third was positioned so that, when the wind blew through the smoke, it reflected the glint of his own weapon. bait for enemy marksmen. When they fired at the illusion, he traced the muzzle flash in another mirror and struck back with perfect timing. It was not luck, but geometry. The gunner had turned the battlefield into a machine, and he was its single, sleepless operator. By the second afternoon, the Soviets had started calling for artillery again. Shells landed closer each time, shaking the ground and blowing apart what was left of the walls. Splinters and glass rained down on him, but still he fired. When one mirror shattered, he replaced it with another, polishing its surface with the edge of his sleeve. The reflections danced and flickered around him, forming a world that was both real and distorted. Fragments of sky, smoke, faces, and fire stitched together into a mosaic of survival. His ammunition ran low by sunset. The supply lines were gone, the rest of his company scattered. Yet he refused to abandon the nest. He scavenged belts from fallen soldiers, pried open ammo boxes with a knife, and rationed every bullet. Each burst of fire was calculated, short, efficient, final. By now, he no longer saw the enemy as men, but as movement, rhythm, pattern. The mirrors told him where they would be before they appeared. He had become an extension of the gun itself, reacting faster than thought. When night fell again, the field went black except for the glow of distant fires. The mirrors caught the flames, throwing faint ghosts of light across the mud. The gunner used them to watch the shadows shift, to see the enemy crawling closer in the dark. He waited until the reflections aligned, then unleashed a storm of gunfire that tore through the silence. The Soviets scattered, convinced there were dozens of gunners hidden in the ruins. They fired wildly into the darkness, hitting nothing but their own confusion. In the brief quiet that followed, the gunner sat back against the cold earth, his breath visible in the dark. Around him the mirrors still glimmered faintly, cracked, soot-covered, but unbroken. They had become his comrades, his eyes, his only link to the living world. Through them he saw everything: the firelight, the fog, the endless motion of a war that refused to end. He didn't know how long he could keep this up. His hands trembled from exhaustion, his ears rang with constant echoes of the gun. But as long as the mirrors reflected light, as long as there was a target to see, he would not stop. Somewhere deep inside, he knew his invention wouldn't win the war. It wouldn't even save him, but it had given him something greater than survival: control in a world that had taken it from everyone else. When dawn came again, his position was still firing. The mirrors, though shattered and blackened, continued to catch the rising sun, flashing across the battlefield like signals from another world. Proof that one man's madness had outlasted reason itself. By the third day, the battlefield had become a mirror of its own, reflecting nothing but death and repetition. The air hung heavy with burnt powder, and the cold had returned, freezing mud into jagged ridges. The gunner's position, once a farmhouse, was now little more than a hollowed pit of bricks and twisted iron. Yet somehow from that ruin, his weapon still barked. Each burst of gunfire echoed through the valley, a sound both mechanical and human, the last heartbeat of a dying front. His world had shrunk to the space of his pit and the fragments of glass that surrounded it. Each mirror was cracked now, the edges sharp, reflecting the chaos and broken pieces. Through one, he saw the tree line, dark shapes moving cautiously between the trunks. Through another, the horizon shimmered with heat and smoke. He no longer looked directly at the world. He saw it through angles, distortions, illusions. The mirrors had become his only truth. They showed him what he needed to see: the glint of a helmet, the flicker of a shadow, and nothing else. The Soviets had changed tactics. No more direct assaults, no more waves of men charging the open field. They advanced in silence now, crawling through the ruins, using smoke and fog as cover. The gunner listened for them: the faint crunch of snow, the soft metallic click of a safety lever. Every sound meant something. Every echo was a direction. His mind worked faster than his body, drawing invisible lines from one reflection to another, calculating angles of fire. It was a deadly geometry, one born not from training, but from desperation. When the first Soviet squad reached the edge of the pit, the gunner was already waiting. He saw them not with his eyes, but through a chain of reflections. A glimpse of a boot in one mirror, the tilt of a rifle in another. He turned the MG-42 and fired a short burst. The bullets cut through smoke, hitting men he hadn't seen directly. They fell without understanding how they'd been found. To them, it must have felt like being hunted by ghosts, but the gunner was no ghost. He was a man unraveling, one breath at a time. His face was blackened with soot, his hands stiff and trembling. He had stopped feeling hunger or cold. Those sensations belonged to a world that no longer existed. When his ammunition finally ran out, he crawled from his pit under the cover of darkness, scavenging belts from the dead. The field was a labyrinth of corpses and twisted metal. The mirrors caught the moonlight, glinting faintly like scattered stars across the mud. Each time he caught sight of one, it felt like seeing a friend still alive. He returned to his gun before dawn, repositioning the mirrors again. Slower now, his movements heavy. The reflections wavered in the gray morning light, their images distorted by cracks and dirt. Yet even broken, they still worked. The first Soviet patrol that approached that morning was met with the same precise fire as before. They fell quickly, and the survivors retreated, convinced they were fighting an unseen force. Inside his bunker of mirrors and mud, the gunner's mind drifted. The reflections began to merge in his vision. Sky, smoke, fire, movement, until it was impossible to tell what was real. He caught glimpses of himself in the shards, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure wrapped in filth, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back. Then the next shell landed close, showering him with dirt and glass, and the moment was gone. By midday, the Soviet artillery had found his range. Each explosion crept closer, shaking the pit and splintering what few mirrors remained intact. The ground trembled with the rhythm of approaching armor. The gunner checked his ammunition, one final belt. He fed it into the MG-42 and adjusted his last unbroken mirror, angling it toward the tree line. In the reflection, he saw the faint glint of tank tracks moving through the snow. He smiled, not out of joy, but something deeper, quieter, like a craftsman admiring his final piece. The setup was crude now, half destroyed, but still functional. The angles were right. The trap was ready. When the tanks emerged, he opened fire, every shot precise, every reflection alive with motion. The mirror world around him shattered with each burst, but he didn't stop. Not until the last cartridge was spent. Not until the glass went dark. When the smoke settled, the field was quiet again. The gun had fallen silent, the mirrors shattered into dust. But for hours afterward, the Soviets still hesitated to advance, afraid of what they could no longer see. The illusion had outlived its maker. When the Soviets finally moved in, they did so with caution. The silence from the German gun position had lasted too long, too complete. Scouts crawled through the ruins, rifles raised, expecting the roar of the MG-42 to erupt again at any second. But there was no sound now, only the hiss of wind moving through shattered wood and the faint metallic ticking of cooling shells. The air still smelled of smoke and oil, heavy with the residue of spent fire. The closer they got, the clearer it became that they weren't approaching a fortress anymore, but a grave. The gunner's position lay in ruins. The ground was torn open, the farmhouse reduced to blackened beams and scorched brick. In the center of it all, the machine gun stood frozen in place, its barrel warped from heat. Around it were fragments of glass, mirrors cracked, melted, some buried halfway in the mud, others reflecting faint patches of gray sky. They glittered faintly in the smoke, like eyes that refused to close. To the soldiers advancing, the sight was unsettling. Even in silence, the place seemed alive, as if watching them. When they found him, he was half buried beneath debris, his body pressed against the tripod as if still shielding it. His hands were locked around the weapon's frame, stiff with cold. His face was turned upward, eyes open but glassy, reflecting the same fractured light as the mirrors around him. There was no fear there, no peace either, only the expression of someone who had passed beyond both. It was clear he had fought until the very last round. Shell casings surrounded him like rings of time, each marking a heartbeat that defied the inevitable. The Soviet soldiers stood for a while in silence, staring at the scene. One of them nudged a mirror with his boot. It tilted slightly, catching the light and flashing across the ruins. Instinctively, half the men ducked, expecting gunfire, but nothing came. The reflection trembled for a moment, then steadied, showing only sky. Slowly they began to realize what he had done. The placement of the mirrors, the strange angles, the overlapping fields of fire. It wasn't madness at all. It was engineering born from desperation, a geometry of death improvised from survival. They dismantled the nest carefully, piece by piece. Some of the mirrors were taken as evidence, others crushed underfoot. The gun was dragged away, its once perfect mechanism jammed with sand and soot. When they finally carried the body out, they laid it beside the wreckage, covering it with a tattered German coat. For a moment the world seemed still again, as if pausing to absorb what had happened here. But war didn't stop for ghosts. Within hours, new orders came down. The position was to be cleared, fortified, and reused for the next advance. The Dead Man's Trench became just another coordinate on a Soviet map, another step in the endless march west. The mirrors were swept aside, the ground leveled, the crater filled. Yet the soldiers who had seen it, the reflection of light flickering where no man stood, the eerie precision of one gun's defiance, couldn't quite forget. That night, as they dug new positions under a sky bruised with cloud, some swore they still saw faint glints across the field, tiny flashes like signals, darting between the wrecks and the snow. They said it was the moonlight hitting fragments of glass. Others said it was something else, the last echo of a man who had fought long enough to become part of the machine he built. By dawn, the front had already moved forward, leaving the place behind. But even as new battles erupted in the distance, the wind still passed through the ruins, carrying a soft, metallic whisper. And on certain mornings, when the light hit just right, something in the mud would glint for an instant, cold, bright, and watching. Weeks later, the front had shifted miles beyond the burned-out farmhouse. The snow was gone, replaced by mud and thawed fields where new graves sank beneath the rain. The war had rolled forward, swallowing everything in its path, cities, rivers, names. But the story of the gunner lingered. It spread through both armies like a quiet rumor, reshaped by each retelling. Some said he had booby-trapped his mirrors, turning them into weapons. Others swore he had survived the bombardment and still fired from another ridge farther west. No one knew the truth, but the legend had outlived the man. Among the German ranks retreating through the spring mud, soldiers spoke of him as if he were a spirit, the gunner who could see through walls, who fought without fear or sleep. To men who had lost faith in orders and maps, the tale was a kind of comfort. If one man could hold the line alone for days, maybe the rest of them still had a chance, if only for another sunrise. Even the Soviets, now pushing deeper into the countryside, remembered his position. Tank crews and riflemen pointed it out from a distance as they passed, a scar in the landscape that no one wanted to approach at night. Some said strange reflections still flickered there, as if shards of glass were buried just beneath the mud, catching stray light and throwing it back at the sky. It became, in its own way, a monument without a name. Far behind the front, a Soviet engineer eventually returned to the site. His unit had been tasked with clearing unexploded ordnance from the area before rebuilding could begin. He found the pit mostly filled with dirt, the weapon removed, the body gone. But as he dug through the debris, his shovel struck something hard. It was a mirror, cracked but intact, its frame bent, half covered in soil. When he wiped the mud from its surface, the reflection startled him. It showed not his own face, but the gray sky above, rippled and distorted. For a moment it felt as if the earth itself was looking back. He set the mirror aside and continued his work, but his thoughts kept returning to it. The angle, the placement, there had been intention here. It wasn't madness, he realized, it was precision. The soldier who built this hadn't been insane. He had simply refused to let the battlefield blind him. In a world where everyone fought what they could see, he had fought what others couldn't. By dusk, the engineer had gathered a small pile of glass fragments, each one glinting faintly in the fading light. He didn't know why he did it, but he arranged them carefully in a line before leaving, as if marking the shape of something invisible. When he stepped back, the setting sun caught the edges just so, sending a brief shimmer across the field. For a second, the ruins seemed alive again. A whisper of movement, a flash of defiance. the ghost of an idea that refused to die. When the wind rose, it scattered the smaller pieces, carrying them across the mud, into the ditches, the riverbeds, the roadsides. Over time, they would be buried, ground down, forgotten. But a few would survive, bits of mirror embedded in the earth, still catching light years after the war ended. Farmers would find them in their fields. Children would pick them up without knowing what they were. And each time sunlight struck their surfaces, it would flash faintly toward the horizon. Brief, fleeting, but unmistakable. Long after the gunner's name was lost, his reflection remained. Not in history books or medals, but in the scattered fragments of glass that had once doubled his sight, turning one man's impossible stand into a story too strange to fade completely. Even in silence, even buried in mud, his mirrors still did what they were meant to do. They caught the light and refused to let it go. Years passed before anyone returned to that stretch of land again. The war had ended, the borders had shifted, and the world had begun to rebuild itself with uneasy hands. Forests crept back over the ruins, grass grew where the trenches once ran, and the farmhouse that had served as the gunner's fortress was little more than a faint mound under the soil. Only the locals remembered what had happened there. They called it the Field of Mirrors, though few could say why. Sometimes when the evening sun hit just right, flashes of light flickered across the hill, as if something beneath the surface was still catching fire. It was a quiet spring when a group of post-war investigators arrived, a team cataloging battlefields for forgotten graves and abandoned munitions. They carried notebooks, shovels, and cameras that clicked with the precision of science, not war. To them, this place was just another coordinate on a long list. But as they began to dig, they found the ground unusually hard, packed with debris that didn't belong there. Rusted bolts, a melted gun barrel, and then something stranger. Shards of mirror glass, buried deep, layered like scales under the earth. The men paused to study them. Even after all the years, the pieces still reflected faintly, catching the pale sunlight that filtered through the trees. One of the investigators picked up a fragment and turned it in his hand. It showed a distorted patch of sky, but also his own eyes. Doubled, fractured, ghostly. He placed it carefully on a sheet of canvas, unsure why he felt uneasy. By midday, they uncovered the remnants of a position, the outline of a pit, bricks fused by fire, traces of ammunition long corroded. In the center lay the tripod base of an MG-42, half melted, fused into the soil. Around it, more glass, more fragments. It was as though someone had built a nest, not of sandbags, but of reflections. They took photographs, recorded dimensions, marked the site as cleared. None of them knew the story behind it. To them, it was simply wreckage, one of thousands scattered across the continent. But the chief investigator lingered a little longer before covering the pit again. He crouched there, running a gloved hand over the dirt. The arrangement of the mirrors, the careful spacing, the angles, felt deliberate. He imagined a man crouched here years ago, surrounded by these same pieces of glass, seeing the world through them as it fell apart. For a moment, the silence of the forest felt alive again, as if something beneath the ground still remembered the rhythm of machine gun fire. Then the wind shifted, rustling the grass, and the illusion was gone. They filled the hole and left by dusk, their boots leaving shallow prints that the rain soon erased. But as the last truck rolled away, the setting sun broke through the clouds, striking one of the exposed fragments still half buried in the mud. The light reflected sharply, a single flash that darted across the trees before vanishing. In the years that followed, the forest swallowed the field completely. Wildflowers grew where soldiers once fell. The soil turned rich again, nourished by decay. Yet the glass remained, hidden beneath roots and stone, still doing what it was made to do. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the wind died and the world held still, a glint of light would appear among the leaves. Brief, precise, almost intentional. Those who saw it often dismissed it as the sun, but to the few who lingered long enough to watch, the flash seemed to move. Slow, deliberate, as though someone deep beneath the earth was still adjusting his aim. Decades later, the war had become history, something taught, not lived. Roads cut through the old battlefields and farms spread where once there had been fire. The past was buried under years of soil, replaced by fields of grain and quiet rivers. Yet memory, like metal, does not rot. Beneath the roots of a young forest that now covered the forgotten front, pieces of the gunner's mirrors still rested, scattered, cracked, but enduring. And on certain days when the air was still and the light slanted just so, the forest seemed to shimmer as if remembering itself. It was on such a day that a boy from the nearby village found one. He was no older than 12, wandering too far from home, chasing frogs through the damp undergrowth. When his boot struck something hard, he knelt and brushed away the dirt. There, half buried in the black soil, was a shard of glass. Dull at first, then flashing suddenly as the sun broke through the clouds. He picked it up, turning it in his hands. The surface was rough, one side burned and warped, but the other still caught the light. For a moment it showed him two faces, his own and a pale reflection of the forest behind him. He wiped it clean and slipped it into his pocket, unaware that it was a relic, a fragment of a weapon, a piece of a man's defiance. To him, it was just an odd treasure, something beautiful found in a place where nothing should have survived. When he ran home that evening, he showed it to his grandfather, who sat quietly by the window, mending a fishing net. The old man took the mirror, turning it between his fingers, the lines in his face tightening as he recognized the strange shine of war-forged glass. He had fought once, long ago, not far from here. He didn't tell the boy that. He only nodded and said softly, "Keep it, but don't break it." The boy smiled and ran off again, the shard glinting in his pocket. The old man watched him go, then looked out at the forest, where the last light of sunset danced in scattered flashes across the leaves. That night, after the house had gone quiet, the old man sat alone, the air filled with the soft ticking of the clock. He couldn't stop thinking about that piece of mirror, about what might still lie buried beneath the trees. He remembered the stories he had heard as a young soldier after the war, about a gunner who had fought for days alone, building something impossible out of glass and courage. It had sounded like a myth then, but now, with the proof gleaming faintly in his grandson's hands, it felt real. Too real. The next morning he walked to the edge of the forest. The air was cool, filled with birdsong and the smell of wet moss. He stood for a long time, staring at the quiet land, trying to imagine what it had looked like when it burned. The fields had healed, the world had forgotten. But as he turned to leave, the sun broke through again, scattering light across the ground. For an instant, he thought he saw movement, a shimmer of reflections dancing in the distance, as if 1,000 invisible eyes were watching through the trees. He blinked, and the vision vanished. There was only sunlight and shadow. Still, he smiled faintly, touched the brim of his hat, and whispered something only the forest could hear. A kind of salute, perhaps, to the man who had turned madness into survival. By evening, the wind rose, bending the trees, and among the branches, a flash of light flickered once more. Faint, fleeting, but deliberate, like the echo of a long-forgotten signal still waiting for an answer. Years drifted on, and the forest grew thick and wild around the hill where the gunner's mirrors once gleamed. The world outside moved fast. New borders, new wars, cities built where craters had once been. But the hill remained still, hidden beneath layers of silence and roots. Only hunters and farmers passed near it now, rarely stopping. To them, it was just another piece of old ground, but animals avoided it, and birds never nested there. On certain evenings, when the sky was low and gray, the slope seemed to flicker with a strange, cold light. Not bright, not constant, just a pulse, as if the land itself was remembering something. It was during one such dusk that a group of surveyors arrived, mapping the region for a new power line. They worked with machines and metal stakes, recording elevations and soil density. To them it was routine, just another forgotten patch of countryside. But when their instruments began to give odd readings near the crest of the hill, they stopped. Compasses spun slightly off-center, reflections flashed in places where there was no sun. One of the men laughed it off as interference, but another, older and quieter, frowned and stepped closer. In the dirt, half hidden by moss, he found glass. Small, dull pieces, curved like fragments of a broken lens. When he brushed them clean, the light struck them, and for an instant, they glimmered so sharply that it made him flinch. He picked one up and turned it over. It was smooth on one side, blistered and pitted on the other. Not window glass, not natural, something older. He pocketed it without a word. That night, the team camped at the base of the hill. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and rain. As darkness deepened, the older man sat awake beside the dying fire, turning the shard in his fingers. It caught the firelight faintly, flickering as though it remembered a different kind of glow. Not warmth, but flame. Not life, but war. He thought about the soldiers who must have passed through this place, about the lives buried beneath it. The land was quiet now, but it didn't feel empty. Later, when the others slept, he walked up the hill alone. The moon hung low, its light pale and silver. As he reached the crest, the wind rose, moving through the trees with a soft metallic hiss. He stood still, listening. The sound was strange, too rhythmic, too deliberate. It reminded him of something mechanical, like the distant echo of a weapon that refused to die. Then he saw it, a brief flicker, like a flash of a mirror far down the slope. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. Another flash followed, farther off, then another. They weren't random. They came in sequence, like signals. For a moment, the man stood frozen, breath shallow, unsure whether it was trick of light or something else. He raised his shard of glass, angling it toward the horizon, and the reflection leapt from it like a tiny star. And then, silence. The wind stopped. The light vanished. The hill returned to darkness. When the surveyors packed up the next morning, the man said nothing about what he'd seen. He kept the shard in his pocket, unable to shake the sense that the place wasn't finished with him. As they drove away, he looked back once more. The morning sun had risen, spilling light over the treetops. For a brief second, he thought he saw dozens of faint flashes scattered among the branches, like the eyes of something ancient waking. He blinked, and they were gone. But as the truck bounced down the dirt road, the shard in his pocket caught the sunlight and glowed faintly, just enough to leave a thin line of brightness across his hand. And though he would tell no one, he couldn't escape the feeling that somewhere behind him, deep in the forest, the reflections had stirred again, aligning for the first time in years, as if waiting for someone who still remembered how to use them. By the time half a century had passed, the war was little more than a whisper, something spoken of in museums and history books, not in fields or forests. The land had healed over, but scars never vanished completely. They only changed shape. The hill where the mirrors had once stood was now part of a nature reserve, its boundaries marked by wooden posts and fading signs. Visitors came in spring to hike the trails, to breathe the quiet air, unaware that beneath their boots lay the remnants of a battlefield that had never quite gone silent. One autumn afternoon, a small group of historians arrived. They were documenting lesser-known incidents from the Eastern Front, gathering stories that had never made it into official records. One of them, a young woman with a camera and a weathered notebook, had come across a local legend about a ghost gunner who had built a weapon nest of mirrors. It sounded like folklore, the kind of story old men told to make sense of the senseless. But something about it had drawn her here, to this place of stillness and strange light. The forest greeted them with that same uneasy calm that had unnerved generations. The air was cold but clear, and sunlight filtered through the trees in long, pale columns. Every now and then, one of those rays would flash unexpectedly, a quick, sharp glint, like metal beneath the soil. The woman noticed them first. At each glimmer, she stopped to photograph the ground, marking the coordinates with care. Her colleagues laughed, calling it superstition, but she kept at it, her eyes tracing patterns invisible to the rest. When they reached the crest of the hill, she found what she hadn't known she was looking for. A shallow depression in the earth, half filled with moss and leaves, its edges still faintly shaped like a trench. And there, just under a thin layer of dirt, something glassy caught the light. She knelt, brushed it gently, and uncovered a fragment the size of her hand. It was a piece of mirror, warped, its surface still faintly reflective. She lifted it, and for an instant, the forest around her seemed to change, fractured and multiplied, as if the world itself was staring back from 1,000 unseen angles. She felt a chill, not from fear, but recognition. There was purpose in this debris, an intelligence that transcended the destruction that birthed it. It wasn't just a tool of war, it was the mark of a mind that had refused to die quietly. The others called her over, impatient to move on, but she lingered, crouched over the pit, imagining the man who had once crouched here, surrounded by glass and gunfire, holding the line against everything that sought to erase him. That night back at the village inn, she developed her photos in the darkroom. The first few were ordinary, trees, roots, soil. But one image stopped her. It showed the trench at dusk, the ground glowing faintly. In the photo, points of light dotted the frame, small, bright reflections that hadn't been visible to her eyes. They weren't dust, and they weren't lens flares. They formed a line curving upward like a constellation. She stared at the image for a long time. Something about the alignment looked deliberate, almost mathematical. It reminded her of diagrams she'd seen of old defensive fields of fire, arcs, angles, geometry. For a moment she imagined that the reflections were still working, still forming the invisible web the gunner had once built to see without being seen. The next morning, before her team departed, she returned alone. The forest was misted over, the air cool and silver. Standing where the trench had been, she raised her camera again and waited. The fog thinned, the sun broke through the clouds, and the light returned. Faint flashes moving across the undergrowth in sequence, one after another, like a message sent and received across decades. When she lowered her camera, the forest was silent again. She touched the fragment of mirror in her pocket, its edge worn smooth from her thumb. It reflected nothing now but her own eye, tired, searching, but alive. She smiled faintly, then turned and began the walk back down the hill. Behind her, unseen, the light flickered once more. 3 brief flashes in the exact rhythm of a signal, before fading back into the stillness of the earth. Years later, long after that visit, the story of the mirror gunner resurfaced once more. Not in textbooks or documentaries, but in fragments, scattered through local folklore, academic footnotes, and the memories of those who had walked the hill and seen the impossible. The photographs the historian had taken found their way into an exhibition about forgotten soldiers of the Eastern Front. One image in particular caught attention, a black and white shot of a quiet forest trench glowing with faint unnatural points of light. The description beneath it read only, "Unidentified reflections, former battlefield site." Visitors paused before it longer than any other photograph. Some said it looked like stars reflected on water. Others felt it was something deeper, the residue of a man's will caught between light and earth. No one could agree on what it meant, and that mystery became its power. Soon articles appeared, speculating about optical illusions, residual metals in the soil, or even paranormal echoes. The truth, as always, remained out of reach. Decades passed again. The forest thickened, the trails overgrew. The hill faded from maps. Only locals still knew its name, the Field of Mirrors. They said that on certain evenings, just before the sun dipped below the trees, flashes could still be seen, moving in deliberate sequence, like coded signals. Most dismissed it as trick of light, the play of sun through branches. But the old ones shook their heads. They knew better. One summer evening, a storm rolled through. Rain lashed the forest, wind bent the trees, thunder rolled across the hills. When the storm passed, the world seemed scrubbed clean, the air electric and sharp. A hiker wandering the trail stopped near the old ridge and looked out. The ground steamed, glistening with rainwater. And then, just for an instant, the light broke through the clouds, scattering into hundreds of flashes all across the slope. Not random, aligned, alive, pulsing. It looked impossibly like a system coming back online. The hiker stood frozen. The flashes moved in rhythm, rippling from left to right, vanishing and returning, like the slow breathing of the land. Then the sun shifted, the moment passed, and the forest returned to stillness. But something lingered, a sense that the light had answered something unseen, that it had recognized its own reflection. That night, as darkness fell over the valley, the last rays of dusk caught the edge of a single mirror fragment still embedded deep in the soil. The beam traveled to another and another, down through the layers of buried glass, forming for a heartbeat a chain of faint light beneath the ground. The remnants of the gunner's design, still aligned after all these years. It glowed softly, pulsing once, twice, then faded as the stars took its place. The world above had forgotten him, his name, his face, his impossible trick. But the earth had not. His mirrors, cracked and scattered, still held their final purpose. To see, to reflect, to endure. They had outlasted their maker, the war, the reason they were built. And somewhere in the silence between wind and shadow, the hill waited. The trees whispered, the soil breathed, and the faintest shimmer of light passed through the leaves. A ghost of brilliance, born of smoke and madness, still holding its line. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.